My late husband, Emery, and I were high above the Costa Rican rainforest, touring through the forest canopy. A tram like this took us high above the treetops through the leafy greenery where we could experience a unique biosphere. At one point, we stopped and asked our guide a question that had been bugging me the entire time we were in Costa Rica. We kept hearing about the eyelash viper, a small, highly poisonous snake with fleshy protuberances that looked like eyelashes. I had no sooner asked my question than our able guide glanced around and instantly pointed to a small yellow neon snake inches from our face. Now, we were more bemused than frightened, realizing how blind we were to something that was right there in front of our faces. But the guide grew up in the rainforest. He knew the creatures, knew their habitats, knew the very trees that we were in, the way the rest of us know the palms of our hands. It's the kind of familiarity that comes from an immersion in the life of the forest. That's something that no visitor touring for a week or a few days can achieve. That kind of sight, that ability to pluck something out of the environment, is accomplished by long hours of quiet study, listening more than speaking, breathing in the forest's sounds and its silences, and learning from mistakes because one has been guided by those who have gone before. What we also realized is that while we and the rest of the tourists had been blithely traveling along, observing the surface of the rainforest, our guide had been looking out for danger, observing changes, seeking rare birds and butterflies, and snakes, as well as less pleasant creatures. It's true of our spiritual life as well. One can either be a tourist or be immersed in God's very own life. We can be immersed in the life of God or be tourists blithely traveling along, oblivious to both the dangers and the blessings that are right in front of us. To paraphrase Kathleen's sermon from a few weeks ago, this immersion doesn't require any secret sauce. It doesn't require belonging to the right church or knowing ancient Greece. It doesn't require a seminary degree or a minimum giving level. Struggling this week with yet another video of a Black man being killed in cold blood, struggling with the sight of peaceful protesters being dispersed with pepper gas and rubber bullets, mourning over small businesses torched, I had to ask myself, Deb, what world are you immersed in? What voices are you listening to? What flora and fauna are you observing? It gave me pause, this question. I'd been so focused on the sights and sounds of our troubled world that I had forgotten that I myself am immersed in the community of God. I'd forgotten that you and I are immersed in the life of the Trinity. And how easy is that forgetting? Technology that can bring us in touch with broiling ice caps and a few seconds later whisk us away to the cries for justice on our streets. We see images of abandoned streets, which are then replaced by law enforcement officers taking a knee on those same streets with white and black and brown people crying out in lament. With our cell phones, we can hold the virtual world in our hands. Our TVs and other screens through our TVs and other screens, we can drown in the tsunamis of exploding emotions. Even in less troubled times, we are immersed in the worlds of advertising, entertainment, and the countless secular voices telling us who we should be, how we can be popular, smarter, and even more powerful than the next person. Naturally, immersed in our own concerns, we can forget that there is anyone else who matters. So it's easy, especially when the world seems on fire, to forget that every last one of us is in fact immersed in a different world, a very different world. It's easy to forget that we have already been immersed in the very life of God. And it's easy to forget this reality because we are in between times, and also because we lose touch with Jesus. For it is Jesus that brings us into the very heart of God. He shows us the way to become beloved community, the people of God who are little Christ bearers and mirrors of the life of the Trinity. And it is only through our immersion in God can we see our way clear to be the people that we are created to be. It is only through our immersion in the life of God that we can heal our divisions and become the world that God created. It is only through our listening more deeply, more humbly, and more intently to God's living voice that we can be actors in God's work of world transformation. Times like these demonstrate how much the world cries out for a richer, fuller image of God than the ones that have been so prominent. Ask most people where God is in the midst of COVID-19, police brutality, race riots, and bipartisan divisions, and many folks are stumped. Some, believing that they have absolute clarity about disease, law, order, the nature of poverty, and the role of authority, say that God is punishing us. Others think that God has left the world to its own devices, leaving us to figure things out on our own. Questions of suffering, when one believes in a dispassionate, all-powerful God, are met with pat answers. God is angry. God has a plan that is beyond our knowing, etc. Neat, pat, and massively unsatisfying and unbiblical answers. Yes, you heard me right. The notion that God is above the world and is unreachable, that God that does not care, that God is impassive, are unscriptural. Don't believe me? Listen to what we've just heard. The Bible is a book that opens with poetry. Genesis stories, whether it's the story about how you and your spouse met, or your stories about first striking out as a young person, those Genesis stories create the very foundation for how the rest of the story will go. And what a foundation we've been given. We have poetry, not a manifesto, not a battle plan, not a management manual, but love poetry, about how God poured out God's very own self to create the world and to declare it over and over again, good, good, good. The poetry also describes how mankind was made in God's image, male and female. And that was declared to be very good. But for so long, we have lost the feminine face of God. Times like these call out for a rediscovery of that feminine face of God, a rediscovery of the image of God as the very personification of selfless love. Now, it's true that before Jesus, God's Spirit was indeed in the world, but interactions with regular people were rare and were usually moderated by different prophets. But since Jesus, particularly since the incursion of the Holy Spirit into every corner of life, we are immersed in God, united with God and one another. Because Jesus suffered, he brought all the sufferings of the human family into the very heart of God. In Jesus, we see God's compassion poured out. In Jesus, we see solidarity with the suffering. And in Jesus, we can learn how the victory of shalom is not won by the sword of a warrior God, but by the awesome power of compassionate love. Let me repeat that. The victory of shalom is not won by the sword of a warrior God, but by the awesome power of compassionate love. In and through solidarity with those who suffer. That's what Roman Catholic theologian Elizabeth Johnson writes. The cross of Jesus then shapes the world in a completely different way than what we see in our world, in the techniques of dominance and violence. But the way to see how we can be part of those shaping the world into a beloved community that is a place that is truly God's kingdom, a place where God's will is done on earth as in heaven. In order for us to do that, we need an immersion in God's life. We need to move from being spiritual tourists to people immersed in God's own life so that we can be guides for those who, like us, are struggling. Now, it's been said that what you notice grows. Often, the media wants you to notice blood on the streets and in divisions. There's a reason that old phrase, if it bleeds, it leads, is true about the media. And add to that the fact that our own biases lead us to seek out things that confirm our prejudices. If we yearn to live in the promise of God's shalom, wholeness on earth that matches the delight and joy and selflessness that is at the very heart of God's own being, we need to begin by moving from being spiritual tourists to being immersed in God. For every hour that we spend on social media, is it possible that we can spend 2 minutes in quiet praise and adoration? For every single article that we link to, can we read one of Jesus' stories? For every bad news story we hear, can we look intentionally for the ways that God is acting around us? In the forest of our current malaise, can we name and notice God at work? In the policemen and women who took a knee with protesters, in the strangers who have lined the streets of Minneapolis with bags of food for hungry school children. Who can we look for God in the words and work of Flint Sheriff Chris Swanson, who cast off his riot gear and joined the protesters there in a peaceful march? Chris Swanson, who admitted since last week he can now count a number of Black Lives Matter members as his friends. To become immersed in the world as the community of God, we start by listening. We understand that the hope for change begins within each of our hearts, acknowledging systemic racism and oppression and vowing to do more ourselves. Because we are called to be guides. That's what Jesus means when he calls us to be disciple makers. And we are empowered to be guides to the new world that God is creating. I can't do this on my own, and neither can you. When I'm blithely traveling along as a tourist, I need guides, that's every one of us, to point out the poisonous viper right in front of me. I need a guide to help me see Jesus in our world when it seems that he is camouflaged and hidden. I need an immersion in the reminders that God created a good world and that in Jesus, the sufferings of this time may well be the birth pangs of a new, more loving and more just world. I need a reminder through our community that Jesus is indeed with us until the end of the ages. And then, rising from fear, rising from anger, rising from sadness and confusion, we all can be immersed in a new vision so that you and I can guide others into abundant life and into the peace that passes all understanding.